Didn't Command & Conquer Generals just come out? It's only been 8 months since the release of that game, but already it's got its first expansion pack. You might expect that an expansion pack that was put together in just 8 months might be a little kind of threadbare, not have too much to it. But you'd be wrong if you assume that about Command & Conquer Zero Hour. This is actually, by all means, a fully featured expansion pack. It's got a lot to it. It does what any good expansion pack to a real-time strategy game ought to do, which is that it adds appreciable amounts of new content, and in so doing it adds appreciable amounts of depth to the game. So it makes CNC Generals even more interesting than before, adds the sort of stuff you'd expect: new units, new generals' powers, new building types, that sort of thing. And it also has a few interesting new twists that you might not have expected from a product like this. In any case, as I hope you'll gain from what I'm about to explain, it's certainly a must for fans of the first game. And for those who maybe thought that Generals could have used a bit more polish in some areas, it might get those types of players to really pick up on this game now more than ever before. The most interesting addition in Zero Hour is the introduction of these various sub-factions to the game. Whereas Command & Conquer Generals, the original game, clearly took inspiration from some of Blizzard's real-time strategy games with the whole interface design and things like that, Zero Hour takes some inspiration from Ensemble's games like Age of Empires 2. That's because these new sub-factions are basically subsets of the core factions introduced in Generals. So basically, in addition to the USA, China, and GLA factions from CNC Generals, you now have 3 unique specialized factions for each side, for a total of 12 different sides. So much like the different civilizations in Age of Empires 2, these new sub-factions in Zero Hour aren't completely different. So for example, you've got like the Air Force General for the USA side. He's got most of the same units as what are available in the standard vanilla USA armies, but he specializes in Air Force. He has a couple of unique flying units and can produce flying units cheaper. So these various new generals, there's like a tank commander, there's an infantry commander, there's a GLA guy who specializes in toxins, and another who specializes in camouflage. All of these are based off of existing and popular playing styles for the game, so it's very likely that the way you play generals is represented by at least 1 or 2 of these various generals, who each have their kind of own unique portrait and personality, and are the way that these new sub-factions are presented. So it adds some interesting new twists to the game. These sides do have their own unique abilities to an extent, and they play somewhat differently from each other, and from the way that the core factions play. So all in all of a sudden, instead of just having 3 different sides, you have 12. And again, while they're not dramatically different from each other, they do create a lot more variety. You could use them both in the skirmish and also in the multiplayer, as well as in the new Generals Challenge mode. The Generals Challenge is actually structured after something like Mortal Kombat or other fighting games. You pick your character, you get a versus screen and everything, and you proceed to take on the enemy generals on their own turf, one after another. The fact that you take on these other rivals on their own terms is what makes this mode interesting. So basically, you'll always be fighting in conditions that are advantageous to the specific powers of the general you're fighting against. So, and also because the difficulty of Zero Hour has been upped a notch from generals before it, these various missions can be quite challenging and a good bit of fun. What's really nice about them is you hear the opposing general pretty much taunting you throughout the mission. They don't just say the same thing over and over. There is a bit of repetition sometimes, but they actually have a lot of really nice contextual dialogue. So if they blow up your barracks, or if you destroy their airstrip or something like that, they'll have some choice words for you depending on what just happened.
So, you've made it across the river. Now the battle gets interesting.
In addition to the Generals Challenge, you've got 3 new kind of more traditional campaigns for each of the main factions. These dutifully introduce some of the new units and abilities and such, and just have a lot of the same sort of pyrotechnics and impressive type stuff going on that the original Generals campaign missions had. These are kind of good-sized and and exciting scenarios. You see some new stuff in them, like gigantic full-scale aircraft carriers and things like that. So these missions can be a good bit of fun as well. The new units added to each side don't necessarily cause you to completely have to reinvent your strategies or anything like that. Most of the heavy-hitting units from Generals remain the heavy-hitting units in Zero Hour, but each side now does have various interesting new support units. For example, the GLA gains basically this little motocross bike. It's pretty cheap. You can mount any infantry unit on it, and depending on which type of unit you have sitting on this bike, it'll act differently. So you throw a terrorist onto it, and it becomes this little explosive bike that you can run into in droves into the enemy's base and crash into stuff. So that's a good fun unit. The USA side has something called the Avenger, which can paint targets with a laser guidance system and causes all other units around it to fire more accurately and more powerfully at that target. Or it's also an anti-air platform. So most of these units are multi-purpose. They don't just do one thing. They do 2 or 3 different interesting things. So collectively, they do add a good bit of variety to the game, and especially once you factor in the new General's powers available to each side and some of the new building types. USA gets a new defensive platform, the Firebase. China gains the Internet Center, which hackers can pile into and gain more money for China's war effort. And the GLA can build a bunch of fake structures, which can then be turned into real structures if you want. So there's just a whole lot of devious, kind of wicked stuff that you can do in this game. The units are well thought out. They're interesting. They feel like little, they feel like little toys. They look so real, and they take damage as they get injured and stuff like that. So there's just a lot of fun stuff to play with in this game, as there was in Generals before it. Zero Hour also introduces some new tweaks and improvements just to the core gameplay since the original release of Generals. They're little subtle things. They're not immediately noticeable, but things like how your super weapons have hot buttons on the screen, so you don't have to kind of click back to your nuclear warhead to launch it off. There's just a little button right there, and your General's powers are easily accessible. There's now an option to use the right mouse button for issuing orders, so that was a complaint that some people had about the original interface of Generals. There are these subtle little things that do make this game more playable. The engine has been modified as well, so it may well run more smoothly on your system than what you remember. So all in all, this is just a better, stronger game, more variety, more depth, some neat stuff that's quite original in the General's Challenge mode, and some cool new campaign missions. So all in all, you've got a really great expansion pack here that's a follow-up to a game that was great to begin with. You could tell that Zero Hour is the result of some very careful scrutiny of what were the best things about Generals in the first place and what were the sorts of things that could be made even better. So again, by all means, if you're a fan of the first, check it out.